elders, as well as Australian South Sea Islanders tonight, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to our new home in Redfern, and to pay my respects to the elders and the traditional custodians of the land on which we're meeting tonight. Tonight we are going to be hearing not only from the people in our community who are the descendants of, not only people in our community who are the descendants of the people in the film, but I think we are also going to be hearing, in a sense, directly from the ancestors of the elders who are here tonight, and I'm really looking forward to seeing this film. To start off, we'd just like to have Auntie Faye come and do a welcome to country.
Before I begin, I would like to say thank you to Imelda for the invitation, and thank you to the Salvation Army. When I was a little girl and I lived down in George Street, I used to go to the Salvation Army that used to be down in Cope Street, and every Saturday evening they would come around and collect us from our house, and we were so proud because that's how we learned to play the tambourine. So we used to march past our house all the time and look in the front door, and then we'd end up on the top of Redfern Hill of a Saturday night playing our tambourines. So that's how I first knew about the Salvation Army. I would now like to pay my respects to the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, to our elders both past and present. I would also like to pay respects to both Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people here this evening, and to welcome you on the country. Sit back, relax, and God bless. Thank you.
Thank you.
So tonight isn't necessarily like a real formal event, and we just happen to have this very recent connection with the Australian South Sea Islanders of Port Jackson, and we were offered the opportunity to screen this film, and I jumped at it and said absolutely yes, because although the Freedom Partnership is focusing on modern slavery, we do have this history of slavery in Australia's past, and in the 10 years that I've been here, I've found that many people are still unaware of it. And the question for me has been, how can we focus on ending modern slavery when we have yet to deal with slavery of the past? So I'm very keen to learn from you all, to upskill myself in the campaigns that you might be running, learn more about this history so that we can think about ways that we might work together, because I really feel like this is something that the Salvation Army would want to get behind and that we should be getting behind. So I'm so pleased that we were able to make the connection and that we can share this film and hear from you all tonight. So with no further ado, I'd like to introduce Imelda Davis from the Australian South Sea Islanders of Port Jackson, who will guide us through our evening tonight.
Let's keep it casual, eh? Thank you very much. For those who don't know me, Imelda Davis, President of the Australian South Sea Islanders, Port Jackson branch, proud South Sea woman, and I'd just like to acknowledge country before I start, the Gadigal people, and this is the Eora Nation, and always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Our organisation, I guess, started in 2009, and I won't talk too much about the history, but today marks 22 years since recognition. 1994, the Commonwealth Government recognised Australian South Sea Islanders as a distinct cultural group. This recognition came from a campaign led by Mrs. Faith Bandler, family from the Tweed, Phyllis Corowa, Nessuan Nares and Patricia Corowa, and many other leaders in the South Sea Islander community who were funded through, well, it was a reaction to the Evatt Foundation's support at Sydney University in assessing the demographic of our people, and that led to that recognition. 2000 saw Queensland recognise Australian South Sea Islanders. Then there was an action plan in 2001, which now has been, I guess, dissolved. And more recently, 2013, New South Wales Parliament recognised Australian South Sea Islanders. and 2014, Federal Parliament debated that Australian South Sea Islanders are the descendants of a slave trade. We'll be talking more about that this afternoon or this evening. One of the things, I guess, for our organisation is that we are challenged with surviving as a not-for-profit and unfunded organisation. So it'd be really great if any of the great minds in this room today have suggestions in how we can look at sustainability for this very important organisation in taking our stand as a part of this multicultural, beautiful society that we live in. All other nationalities and Pacific Island groups are recognised and included in funding strategies. Australian South Sea Islanders fall between the gaps. We are still struggling to convince the government that we are here and we have survived. My grandfather was taken off Tanner Island at the age of 12. That's my mother's father, brought here to cut sugarcane, passed away, never saw his family again. You know, this is only one story of thousands across this nation. I'd also like to thank a few people before we get too far, and that's Auntie Faye Carroll for taking the time out this afternoon to welcome us onto country. Thank you. Professor Clive Moore has been working with us for the last 6 years. Now, without Professor Clive Moore, we wouldn't have a basis to work from. It's really important that we work from a factual, accurate base, a historical basis. Whether you agree with it or not, that's the foundation that we come from. It's up to us as Australian South Sea Islanders, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, to take a stand in documenting our histories and factual stories. It's really important to get the basis right, and then if you want to challenge that, then do so through the relevant channels. And through this organisation, this is some of the work we hope to achieve over the next, God knows how many years. But anyway, we're still fighting. So Professor Clive Moore, I just want to commend you and thank you for your contribution. And he rolls with the punches, believe me. And, you know, he's an honorary South Sea man because he takes a lot and he gives a lot. And he's here in a voluntary capacity tonight, and I thank him for that. Auntie Shireen Malamu has been the backbone of our organisation. She's the political savvy. Through her, as one of our first ASSIPJ commissioners, she's really broken down the walls and opening up those conversations, firstly with the City of Sydney, when myself, Graham Mooney, Auntie Shireen were the 3 or 4 people going into the offices there, and she wouldn't take no for an answer. Not to mention all the other, you know, ministerial connections she has, and a world of knowledge. So just wanted to acknowledge Auntie Shireen tonight, and she just came back from Sorry Business in Townsville, and I just want to thank you for taking time out. It's really appreciated. Auntie Pearl Waimara, thank you so much for being a part of our conversation from Cape York, wanting to learn more about this rich history that we have. Representative of Aboriginal Torres Strait communities, but you know, again, another great activist through other platforms in terms of religion is your basis, and I just want to thank you for taking time out to learn and share with us tonight. Jenny, the Salvation Army, Alison, Sydney, without you guys, it was such an opportunistic moment at Sydney Alliance. Sydney Alliance has actually created this connection for us, and I just want to thank you for taking up the opportunity and opening the doors so freely. It's just incredible to be in a venue like this. As for the board and the amazing people that I work with every day, Zach Wine is our Deputy Vice Chair, an amazing young leader, incredible. Everybody knows him, he's all over town. But I just want to commend you as well for initiating tonight's event and really just being there, you know, as a backstop. My son Shola, our treasurer, just too deadly. And, you know, just your commitment and outstanding, you know, performance the whole time. As young people, it's about the legacy we leave our children, you know, and it's really impressive that you guys have taken up the challenge. And I'm so proud of you guys, really. My daughter Bennett, gorgeous girl, always the backstop, doesn't want to be involved, I'll just do what you say. So, love you for that. I want to acknowledge Auntie Phyllis Corowa's granddaughter here tonight. Auntie Phyllis Corowa and her husband, Zane Corowa, were the first to founder the Australian South Sea Islander ASIA organisation. Auntie Phyllis passed away this year. That's my mother's sister. She was 95 years old, but that Tweed Heads organisation is still standing some 43 years later up on the Northern Rivers in Chindra, where we're from. But, you know, outstanding commitment across the nation. There's a lot like that, but just wanting to acknowledge Auntie Phyllis, because this movement came from the Tweed and it came from those people in particular. So thanks for being here. Other founding members, Danny Togo is not here tonight, but he's our Deputy Vice Chair, and I just wanted to acknowledge him. He couldn't make it. I guess Australian South Sea Islander Port Jackson is a really effective lobby group. We've sat back, we've watched, we've learned in taking on the legacy of our past. We build on what our past South Sea Islander and non-South Sea Islander communities. We can't do this without everybody in this room and non-South Sea Islander people that have been a part of this struggle for many years. So we've found that through people like Murray Geisler to the right here, who's just been incredible, Diana Robinson up the back, who's scribing for us, and my beautiful cousin, of course, Faith Bandler's niece, Serena Voyner up the back. You know, people like this have committed and worked with us for the last 6 years relentlessly, and, you know, for a curry and rice, really. But I just want to acknowledge you guys too, and thank you so much for your commitment. We've been successful because we've been able to work diligently, consistently, and that is the key to success, I believe. We've worked hard in delivering 5 national conferences. On the smell of an oily rag, we got 49,000 to deliver 5 national conferences, and we did that. We achieved that. We had huge numbers, something like 1,000 participants across the nation, and that's through registration. It's not just hearsay. So, you know, that's evident that there's a community out there that wants change. There's a community that wants to leave something for our children, which is more important than anything, is the legacy that we leave for our children. I guess, you know, in moving forward, some of the actions we'd like to see is to actually establish a national body, to get that DGR status that's going to support us to develop and nurture and be inclusive of all Pacific nations, because we are Indigenous to the Pacific. Be inclusive of First Nations people, because First Nations first in all that we do, and in sharing that cultural diversity and connection. Relinking with the families is something that's really critical for our people. Even here in Australia, we don't know, because we were brought here culturally kidnapped and I guess, you know, for want of a better word, discarded. So, you know, this is some of the stuff in moving forward in terms of action. We've got access to historical archival tapes that Professor Clive Moore recorded in 1970. These are oral histories from our people, first generations people of that trade. And those tapes need to be, I guess, scribed, and those stories need to be shared with respect, you know. Reconnection with the families is critical. Australia, Vanuatu and those many islands that people were taken from. And then there's the misappropriation and the deceased estates of our people. 15,000 died as a part of that 40-year trade. The funds from that have gone missing in terms of, well, not gone missing, it's been absorbed back into the Commonwealth. But, you know, these are just some of the platforms that we can really get traction on as a distinct cultural group, and really create a presence for all involved and take our rightful place as a part of multicultural Australia. But thank you, Tomas, and I just want to say Professor Moore's going to get up and take us through a quick PowerPoint, simply because he's got to get a plan back. He's really stretched at the moment, and I really appreciate it. So we'll go through the chat, the PowerPoint presentation, and then we'll watch Sugar Slaves if that's okay. But I'd like to introduce Professor Clive Moore.
Thanks very much, Imelda. I put together short PowerPoint thing, but only about 9 pieces. And in the end, I'll go back to that map which shows all the movements of people, and I'll try and use that to bounce everything off that I say. So just do it for slides for a little while, and then we'll just have the one at the end. There's a great Australian historian by the name of Manning Clark, who once gave a lecture about Sir Robert Menzies, and the only notes he had was a picture of Sir Robert Menzies' face, and he read it, and he talked about Menzies' place in history by looking at his face. Well, I'm not going to do that, but I'm going to use a map, and we'll use that map and try and read that map and use it as the historical interpretation of South Sea Islanders. How did I get involved? I'm not a South Sea Islander. I was born in Mackay, which does explain a few things, because that's the largest South Sea Island community in Australia. Always has been, still is. And so I went to school with South Sea kids, but it didn't, I had no particular sort of interest in South Seas until as I went through university and became a historian, and I was interested in the sugar industry. And I started studying the sugar industry, but I realised that to understand the 19th century sugar industry, you couldn't do it with just documents because you missed out the labour force. And the labour force was actually the South Sea Islanders. So there was money applied for to do oral history work at James Cook University, a very large project. One of the people in it was Henry Reynolds, known to most of you, I would presume, in some way. And they started collecting Aboriginal oral history, Torres Strait oral history, and Australian South Sea Island oral history. And they're the tapes, the South Sea section of those tapes that Imelda is talking about, because they have been transcribed from cassette tapes onto CDs, and it looks as if they'll end up as a home in the National Library for preservation, but that still doesn't make them accessible totally. And the dialogue we have to go through is making them accessible. Maybe that's transcripts. I don't know exactly how it would be done, but now is the time, I think, to continue the conversation about that. Now, I thought I would jump in the deep end here, because one of the things which I always hear about South Sea Islanders, particularly from South Sea Islanders, is that they came here as slaves. And not that I have a falling out with South Sea Islanders, but I'm a trained historian. And I'm not, after 40 years, yes, I am involved. I suppose I'm emotionally involved. But historians, it's not my job to get emotional. It's to look at the documentation and to look at, listen to oral history and try and work out what the truth and the origins of it is. So I'd really like to put it in the context of the slavery debate to start with. Now, here, through the Salvation Army, we've got Slavery Happens in Australia. At the front door, Sugar Slaves, and you'll be watching the documentary Sugar Slaves later on. It was made in the 1990s. It's very good, even though I'm in it. I had black hair and a beard, so you'll see if you could recognise me. It wasn't a long time ago. But the context of the slavery debate. Now, slavery, and the two words which get thrown up very often, one is blackbirding too, which is a unique word which gets applied to South Sea Islanders. And it usually, the origins of it seem to be to steal men. That's basically what it means. And there's a bit of a debate whether it comes out of the African slave trade or whether it has other origins, but it's the standard word that you'll hear used. The other one, of course, is Kanaka, which is slightly derogatory. It was totally derogatory in the 19th century, but it's been retrieved by Australian South Sea Islanders, often these days in the form of Kanak rather than Kanaka, and which is a French version of the same word, and it just means bush. It's a Hawaiian word, it's not a Melanesian word at all, it means bushman. But you'll find Kanaka used, you'll find blackbirding used, and you'll find slavery used very often. Now, slavery was a legal concept that was used in the British Empire and most European empires and in other places. In the British Empire, it was actually abolished in 1833. So, historians mind talking? Strictly speaking, you can't be a slave in the British Empire after 1833. I see a head shaking there. Now, but you've got to put that into context. That's only 30 years after that the first South Sea Islanders come into Australia. The American Civil War is being fought between 1861 and 1865 about the issue of slavery. And at that same time, there's a transition going on between the polite word for what blackbirding did was it's called indentured labour. And theoretically, people weren't slaves, they were indentured labourers, so they signed on with a contract, but they signed on with a contract they couldn't read nor understand because they weren't literate. So, and they signed it usually with a thumbprint. So, you know, this is white man's legal tricks going on here. So, you know, the proper term, which a historian is likely to use, is indentured labour. But in some ways, it's a misuse, it's a wrong interpretation. And you've got to put this whole thing into context. 1860s, slavery is still alive and flourishing in North America, and there's a war. At the same time, the first Solomon Islanders are being stolen away, and I discovered recently about half a dozen Solomon Islanders in 1857 were taken to Mauritius in the middle of the ocean on the other side of Australia, never to be seen again. At that same time, a little bit later, early 1860s, people were kidnapped and really treated as slaves and taken to mines in Peru. This is about 1861, 1862. The first South Sea Islanders to come in as indentured labourers into Australia were probably in about not first, we'll have a little run backwards there, but the first ones into Queensland were about 1860 into Torres Strait. They weren't the same people as often we talk about Queensland labour trade, South Sea Islands, 1863 to 1904. But the ones who came in before that actually came in straight from Sydney. So they go straight from Sydney to Torres Strait. So the first Loyalty Islanders, and they're just from off New Caledonia, and Southern New Hebrideans came into Queensland between about 1860 and 1863. Now, slavery actually continued in lots of European jurisdictions or lots of European legal systems up to about the 1890s. I think Portugal, I think Dutch, not certain about the Spanish. So that legally, then slavery is abolished in the 1830s. The mind of slave owners hasn't been abolished, and Europeans still continue to use slavery as a legal mechanism right up to about 1890s, 1900s. Put this further into context, in the 1860s when this is coming, think about Queensland. Indigenous Australians were being hunted and exterminated in the 1860s. You know, there's no nicer way to put that. That's exactly what was happening. So again, you've got the same Europeans who might have been involved in that, who were involved in bringing South Sea Islanders into Queensland. So there are different words, there's different ways people interpret words. As a historian, I would say it's a new kind of slavery, or it's something akin to slavery. I won't say it's slavery, because and neither will a government. A government or a lawyer will say, well, strictly speaking, you can't be a slave, but we know the way Indigenous Australians were treated, which is no different from slaves. We know that some of the things that went on in the labour trade, as we call it, it's a nice, clean word, was very, very close to slavery if it wasn't. And we know that many of them were kidnapped. And at the same time as they were coming here, they were certainly being kidnapped as slaves to go to Peru and South America. So there's it's not clean cut, there's a big mixture of things that are going on at the same time. I have always argued that slavery it's a very strong word, and it's a word which makes politicians cringe. And it's a very useful word for the Australian South Sea Islanders to use, as long as they realise that it's part of a much wider argument. And right at the start, I put several things that should be, the way I would argue it, if I was trying to mount a case, I would say that it was something so close to slavery, and slavery was still occurring at that time, that you've got to think about whether it was slavery or not, even though slavery officially had been abolished. So that you don't forget that argument, you keep it. Where I think the ground is much stronger is that there's absolutely no doubt that of those that came, so say there are about 62,000 labour contracts to Queensland, probably about 50,000 individuals, and about 95% male and about 5% female solely. Now, 10 to 15% of them, all historians would agree that they were kidnapped. Now that's, so that there are laws about what indenture involves, and there's absolutely no doubt that a large part of the process, so 10-15%, we're not noted for exaggeration, we're fairly conservative, so 10-15% were kidnapped. That is illegal in the British system. It's not supposed to be happening. All of them are really, and I think you used the word culturally kidnapped, because no matter how you try and justify it, it's stealing people from out of their culture and taking them into a capitalist white society and using them as cheap labour, when they don't really understand the process they're going through. But a bit late, but if you do make the same trip 2 or 3 times, are you still being kidnapped and culturally kidnapped? You're not totally innocent of the process if you've gone to Fiji and to Samoa and to Queensland twice, and some of them did. It's very complicated. So I would say if a high percentage are kidnapped, all of them really, it's culturally disreputable behaviour bringing them here. The other thing which I think is powerful is that the same basic pay rate applied for 40 years. Now, I suspect that inflation wasn't quite as bad as the 19th century as it is for us today, but even so, anyone can think back 40 years, would you like to be paid today what you were paid 40 years ago? No. So there was an absolutely fixed pay rate. Now, some of them were paid a lot more, and the longer they stayed, the better workers they were, the better they could negotiate with people. But the basic pay rate was fixed for 40 years. Mortality. They had the highest mortality rate of any immigrant group into Australia. Their mortality rate is somewhere between about 25 and 30%. It's about 15,000. Now, that's largely because they lacked immunity to common European diseases. Now, to me, once the government realised that the death rate was so high, for humanitarian reasons, they should have cut it straight away. But they kept doing it for 40 years. They knew they were killing people by bringing them here and exposing them. And also the diseases from here then went back to the islands and killed large populations in the islands. Queensland government knew they were doing that. They never stopped it. So mortality rates. Some of them were clearly maltreated, and there are lots of examples of it. Not 62,000, but there are enough examples to know some really atrocious things happened. All of them were treated with racial contempt, very similar to the contempt given to Indigenous Australians. So that, again, white Europeans in the 19th century, are they really going to say, oh, but you're a South Sea Islander and you're an Aborigine? I don't think so. So it's a very similar attitude they had. And then we had the White Australia policy, and we deported them, or tried to deport them all. Now, again, they're the only immigrant group into Australia which was ever legislated for deportation. Nobody else was. In 1901, there were about 10,000 in Australia. The numbers declined just from attrition, basically. 3-year contracts, some of them go home, you don't renew their contracts, so they're gone. It goes down to about 7,000, but there's still about 7,000 people who are up for deportation at that time. There is no other ethnic group in Australia that was legislatively deported. Only one. Then they were left unwanted in the 20th century. People weren't totally non-compassionate about this. There were humanitarian groups, and this is why there was a Royal Commission and an argument in 1906 that they should be allowed to stay. Certain numbers of, certain categories could stay. And that's why the South Sea families are here today. But they were really unwanted. The white Australians let them stop, but then pushed them out of the sugar industry. And if you came from North Queensland, there really was nothing else to do other than the sugar industry. So they were left on the fringes of white society, and that's part of the problem that it's not only the 19th century that's a problem, there's a 20th century problem. And that's what governments have to realise, that it left South Sea Islanders with very poor educational standards, poor health, large families, unwanted. And it's only really since the 1960s, 1970s that they've come back into the mainstream. They're on the edge. Now, I've talked too much. Can I have my next piece of whatever, this next slide? I just thought, in case some of you are totally lost and geographically challenged, I thought I'd just show you what we're talking about. You're down here, and we're really talking about the nation out there, because people came from, mainly from what's now Vanuatu and the Solomon Islands, but also from the islands off Papua New Guinea, a few from what's now Tuvalu, used to be the Ellis Islands, and a few from the Gilbert Islands, it's almost off that map, and a very, very few from one island only in Fiji, and quite a lot from the Loyalty Islands, which are now French, down just about opposite Brisbane. So we're talking about close neighbours of the Australian colonists. Go to the next slide. I've been talking about Queensland, but as I'm in New South Wales, we really should be talking a little about New South Wales, because the first ones that were brought in here actually came in 1847. There's a gentleman by the name of Ben Boyd, not a very nice gentleman, a very wealthy one. He owned lots of pastoral property. He owned a bank called the Royal Bank. He lived very royally when he was here, and he came across the idea of bringing in pastoral workers for his stations, which he did, and it was total catastrophe. Two lots came in. The New South Wales government was horrified and sort of started to legislate against it. They didn't want them in here because they just weren't prepared for it. And there were two lots that came in. There's some pretty horrible stories out there. Some of them died. They were actually brought in winter time, 1847 winter, taken out to the middle of the Murray River to work. Must have been bloody cold out there. And some of them then sort of mutinied and walked back to Sydney. It was a pretty horrific time. Not large numbers, but it's important that we don't just think this is a Queensland thing. It's something that also belongs to New South Wales. In fact, it begins in New South Wales. Next one. This is our famous map that Imelda and I have sweated a lot of blood over, and so did the cartographer. I think he's now bloodless. We drafted it because it gives a nice visual picture of what's going on. And it does two things that no other map does. It indicates that they weren't just sugar workers, because those people that came in were also early on, in particular, in the maritime industry in Torres Strait, and also in the pastoral industry. So that we insisted that the mapmaker put in Charleville and the Darling Downs and Roma and Dalby and Cloncurry, Charles Towns, Normanton. Our map didn't quite go into the Gulf of Carpentaria. There should be more in the Gulf of Carpentaria. It wasn't just coastal. And that is why the islander community today has extensive kinship networks with Aboriginal Australians and Torres Strait Australians. And it goes right back to the 1860s. So it's wrong to see them as just sugar workers, they actually move very widely in New South Wales, inland, and also in Queensland, extensively in Queensland. Now, we'll get back to that map and we'll try and read it again, I promise, but we'll just go through all of these and then we'll... next one. The other thing which you have to realise, we're inclined to see this, okay, we said it's Queensland, and labour contracts, you have to, someone like me as a historian, has to see this in a much wider picture because there's a grand movement in the 19th century of indentured labour, and before that there was a grand movement of slave labour. But if you use the word, a contract indentured labourer, if you look at those examples in the Pacific between 1848 and 1941, an indenture really continues to be used till just before the Second World War as a process. The Queensland part of it's quite small. It's only about 6%. So Fiji is actually fractionally larger because you're bringing in Indians into Fiji as well as Solomon Islanders and New Hebrides or New Vanuatu. You've got a huge movement within Papua New Guinea once it's a colonial area. Hawaii is extensive because, how do all the Japanese and the Filipinos, if you go to Hawaii, you might wonder where they came from. They were indentured labourers. That's their origins. So Samoa, Hawaii, New Caledonia, Queensland, Fiji, Solomon Islands, Vanuatu and Papua New Guinea, you have to see it as one picture. And it doesn't stop in 1901 just because Australia stops in 1901. It's part of a much larger movement which is just ongoing. Can we hear the next one, Zach? Two more sort of pictorial ones for you. The pie graph divides up the origins of those that came into Queensland. Now, they're overwhelmingly from Vanuatu, about 2/3. The second group are the Solomon Islanders, about, there's 26% there. And they came in from New Guinea, they came in from the Loyalty Islands, but then you've got other groups, you've got Asian indentured labourers that came into Queensland, Sinhalese, people from Ceylon, Sri Lanka, Indians, Japanese, various ones came in. That accounts for an Asian group. And then you've got the smaller group which come from Kiribati and Tuvalu that used to be the Gilpin and Ellice Islands. The other one is the long graph, and you start off with New Hebrides, or New Vanuatu, and then Solomon Islands, they start in 1863. The Solomon Islanders start in 1870 or 1871. So you've got this very early on large New Hebridean population, and then the Solomons come up and exceed them by about the 1890s, which is why there's a significant Solomon Island community left here today, because at the time, around 1901, they were actually the majority that were here, and the New Hebrideans had receded a little, but I usually say 2/3 New Hebridean, 1/3 Solomon Islander, roughly, but it explains the origins of that. Next one, Zach. The other thing that I think we need to show is the main areas where you will find Australian South Sea Islanders today, and we shouldn't leave Sydney out, but really you're talking about, you are talking about the sugar coast, and you're going from Mossman in the north, just think of where is the sugar cane, starts at Mossman, goes down to the Tweed. In all of those areas you will find fairly extensive South Sea Islander communities spread out right down the coast. And one of the marvels that they started coming together politically in the 1970s, but how you think 1970s long distance what they call them, STD calls were actually very expensive in the 1970s. They weren't cheap. Now your phone calls are cheap. Building a communication network before there were computers and email messages, and telephones were expensive, and not everybody had a telephone back in that stage, was quite amazing. The way that they networked and politically brought all those diverse groups together. And there've been a lot of fractures along the way, but I think it's an amazing political lobbying movement that has occurred from the 1970s onwards. I'd remind those people, though, that they shouldn't forget that the Pacific Islanders Association was first founded in 1901, and the South Sea Islanders at deportation time started their own political organisation, and they protested, and various religious people and humanitarian groups assisted them. But you know, there had been political lobbying by South Sea Islanders for an awfully long time. And in 1901, 2 South Sea Islanders got on a boat and went to Melbourne and went to see the Prime Minister twice. Now, your chances of getting into the Prime Minister's office twice now are very slight, I would think. But they had amazing guts. I mean, yes, they were assisted to do it, but to get on a ship, no aeroplanes then, I hate to tell you. You get on a coastal ship and you go to Melbourne, you'd have to change a couple of times on the ships on the way down, and they went to see the Prime Minister and they said, this is not fair, what you're doing. We have lived here for 20 years. We no longer have contact with our peoples back in the islands. Why are you doing this to us? Quite remarkable people. Last one, and this is where I will stop, because this is the one that I said I'd read to you, and I'll try and do that now. You've got an Australian frontier, colonial frontier, which we know starts in Sydney, and then it goes south, but it also works its way up through Queensland. And by the 1820s, you have a place called Brisbane. It's a convict area. By the 1840s, convictism is over. You're starting to get free settlement and pastoral settlement going up through North Queensland. So think of a coastal east coast frontier moving north. You have another frontier that comes in the islands, and it basically does the same thing. So the Queensland frontier is going from about the 1840s through to about 1900. It's slowly, through pastoralism and agriculture, taking over the Aboriginal areas of Queensland, but they were short of labour supply. And what they decided was that they should exploit the labourers from the Pacific Islands. So the pattern you get is a Queensland, or an Australian frontier moving north from about 1840s through to Mossman in about the 1890s, and you have an island frontier that also moves north. It starts at the Loyalty Islands just off New Caledonia. It goes into the southern New Hebrides, now Vanuatu, in the 1860s. By 1870, it's moved up to the Solomon Islands. By about 1879, it's moved up to Bougainville and the islands off Papua New Guinea. Then at the moment, there's no territorial boundaries in those islands at all. So it's just a free movement. And then you get British and German colonies in Papua New Guinea. Kidnapping has resumed like it had in the earlier period. And then therefore the Queensland labour trade is banned from Papua New Guinea waters. Then the labour trade sort of moves back south again. So think of one frontier going up, another frontier going up and then retreating and coming down and staying steady for about 20 years, and then 870 voyages. So zip, zip, and then you've got your voyages going backwards and forwards. And they start off really in southern Queensland, as you would expect, and then later on, those voyages are going right up into North Queensland. Some ships were going on 2 or 3 voyages a year out to the islands. So the pattern that we tried to show you is the immense complexity of what was going on. You're talking over 40 years, you're talking of about 50,000 people, of about 870 voyages. We know more about the effect in the islands and what happened in Australia than we do what happened on those voyages. I've always been fascinated as a historian to try and work out, I reckon they were hell ships. I mean, could you imagine being on a ship for between 1 month and 3 months, something like that, depends on when you get on board. Some of them were kidnapped, some of them knew what they were doing, there's no doubt about that, but some were kidnapped. Being locked all seasons, so it could be cyclone season, you're locked below in a very, basically in the hold of the ship. Just think about how what graphic do you want me to get? Just think about diarrhoea and vomiting and seasickness and how horrible that trip must have been. I can't imagine it was ever a nice trip. In 870 voyages, I don't think it was a P&O liner. So I still find that very fascinating because we don't know very much about it. But I said I can't come up with a good interpretation of that, only a negative one. So, two frontiers, moving north and retreating south, and then coming across. I once wrote about the Coral Sea and called it the Queensland Lake. And that's roughly, Queensland really thought they owned the Coral Sea. And they owned the people around the Coral Sea. It's not, you see, there are no territorial boundaries, European territorial boundaries in the Coral Sea until really the 1880s and the 1890s. So in the first 20, 25 years, it's a free go out there. There's very little that anyone knows what's actually happening. There's a bit of naval supervision, but very slight, really. So this is what you have. Now, Queensland built a sugar industry largely on the sweat and the backs of South Sea Islanders. In the early period, I said they worked in the maritime industries, they worked in the pastoral industries, they worked in the sugar industries. Their ages varied. We know that, Melda gave you an example, some of them were teenagers, quite young teenagers. Some of them, to be fair, some of them would have come out with uncles and with some family, but there do seem to be lots of examples in the South Sea oral history of kids who really should not have been going anywhere, coming out to Queensland. From about 1880 onwards, they start to get locked out of the pastoral industry and the maritime industry, although they stay in Torres Strait, working up there. And they're limited to the sugar industry, and then once you get trade unions starting up, they get chucked out of the mills. They used to work in the sugar mills, and then by about the 1880s, the rules say, no, you will be a field labourer only. You will not be a mill labourer because you're getting in the way of the trade unions. So they're locked out of the technical side of what's going on, and they're just there for muscle, basically, to clear farms and to cut cane and do things like that. There's a lot that goes on while they're there, and I should probably sort of start winding up, so if you want to ask any questions you can. But, it's not a totally negative interpretation that I'd like to leave you with, because some people stayed by their own choice over very long periods of time. And you might say, well, they were alienated from their home societies and couldn't go home. But they had families here. The missions, the Christian missions moved in on them. Some of them were Christians when they first came in the 1860s. The Loyalty Islanders were certainly mainly Christians, going back that far. You get three major missions, the Presbyterians, what's called the Queensland Kanaka mission that came out of Bundaberg, and the Anglican missions. You get others, you get the Baptists, and I was saying to some people earlier, you also get the Salvation Army. The Salvos reached out to the islanders around Buderim on the Sunshine Coast in the 1890s, 1900s, and many of those actually had Aboriginal wives. So you get Islander Aboriginal mixes around there, and the Salvos, in some ways, they invented tourism on the Sunshine Coast, because the first large-scale gathering on that neck, on the Maroochydore or somewhere around there, was actually a Salvation Army Christian camp of about 1,000 people. And they liked it so much they kept coming back for the next 100 years. So tourism took off with the Salvos on the Sunshine Coast. I don't know if your church is aware of what they did.
Not sure we ever made that much money on it.
Many other things. There's a lot of discrimination. I mean, there's separate hospitals, for instance. So they're not welcome in white hospitals, or if they are, they're in the Kanaka ward of the hospital. Once the kids start going to school, particularly in the early 20th century, is what you call Polynesian provisional schools. The word Polynesian comes up sometimes. It's actually it's the wrong word to use, but Queensland did use Polynesian rather than Melanesian. So that kids went to special islander schools. They were segregated schools. And some of the older generation might even, remember, well, they'd know people who actually attended some of those schools. So they faced tremendous racial discrimination, employment discrimination, medical and educational, and yet they survived. And in the 1900s, those that stayed were largely single men with a nucleus of families. So that the nucleus of marriage couples, not only South Sea and South Sea marriage, but many of them were South Sea and Aboriginal marriages. So that the base of that community goes back to, one of the things I always try and collect sort of South Sea Islander surnames, and even though they're marrying out and the numbers are very large, there's probably only about 50 to 100 original surnames, I would suspect. And then they've had some very large families. So that there is a core there of married couples that, and most of the last of the originals died in the 1960s. There's a couple around Ayr that Shireen might remember, who lived that long. They must have been very young when they first came out. So that first generation, that first immigrant generation then began in the 1860s. The last of them died in the 1960s. And now you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, I don't know, I've lost count. There could even be 6 generations for some of them now. But it's around there somewhere. I think I should shut up and let people ask any questions. Does that seem a sensible way?
Yeah, that's good. Just hang on, we'll get the mic. Sorry, just so everyone can hear you. Go there. Thank you. I just wondered, can you get up?
It's on now.
It's on. It's on.
So I just wanted, Clive, we have a statue of a slaver in Townsville, Robert Towns.
Robert Towns.
And Townsville is named after him. And what about Mackay?
Okay. The question is about Robert Towns, who Townsville is named after, and John Mackay, who Mackay is named after. Both of them were involved in what we nicely call the recruiting trade. Towns was never directly involved. He was a Sydney capitalist, who had his fingers in all sorts of pies out in the islands, in the Bachelamur and Pearling and Sandalwood from about the 1840s onwards. He was the first one to bring South Sea Islanders into Queensland in 1863, but he was always slightly removed from, he never actually, John Mackay was a captain on a labour trade ship. Robert Towns was a capitalist who would do, who just did things for money. And I never knew much about the 1860s, I must admit, because my main area of interest was Solomon Islanders, who don't come over here till the 1870. So historians are slippery creatures. I just didn't worry about 1863 to 1870. Didn't worry me. And then more recently, I actually did a study of Robert because I wanted to answer this question for myself: was Robert Towns a slaver? And I reckon he's a very crooked and devious businessman, but many of those people that he brought out in 1863 were from the New Hebrides, the southern New Hebrides, and particularly from the Loyalty Islands. And the Loyalty Islanders had been moving around the Pacific in the shipping trade from the 1840s onwards, and they were also part of that they were Christians quite early. So that in fact many of the, if you look at what remains of the records, and you're always dealing with partial records, I didn't find very much evidence. Towns was not directly involved, but he was the capitalist who was involved. Were the people who brought out kidnapped slaves? It wasn't my conclusion that they were. However, one of the main people who did his work for him had a very unsavoury reputation as a kidnapper later on, not in 1863. Now you might just say, well, you just don't have the evidence. And it well may be that 1863 the evidence is not there. Certainly by 1868, 69 he's doing very naughty things out there. So that's
He still made money out of it.
I did. He made a lot of money out of it.
Clive, I was just saying, for legislation to deport thousands, I don't know whether it's being done anywhere else.
I
So
know.
even the African Americans say to me, well,
Look at that. There are.
never done to us, and yet by a stroke of a pen and bringing the white Australian policy at the same time, you know.
Look, in the more recent world, there are examples of ethnic groups who have been displaced and removed from countries. They do exist.
I mean,
But
they
that is the
bring
only
about
time.
an economic base to a country,
Yeah.
and then removal.
I don't know of any, on the grounds that you're arguing, that that they built one of Australia's major agricultural industries and then were told to go, and not just told, ordered by legislation. I don't know of any other example in a settler society, if someone can enlighten me, where that occurred. And in Australia, it is the only time that we ever legislated to remove an entire ethnic community.
And I'm just saying about the 15,000 that, I mean, there's, you know, black bodies litter this country, but 15,000 are buried in Queensland. No one knows who they were, who their families were, who, you know, and
Well,
that's what I'm saying. Tell the truth and we all grow up.
Look, again, it's a huge topic, and I had always ignored what's called the Pacific Islanders Fund. I just never checked it out. And I did a few years ago, and I was astounded at what I found. I knew it existed, but I didn't actually investigate it. What the Queensland Government Pacific Islanders Fund was, it contained, when people came out to here, there was a return passage that the first employer had to pay. So that money was kept in a trust fund. Then, when islanders died here, and as Shireen said, there were about 15,000, the remainder of their wages was put into the trust fund, and supposedly it was to be turned into trade goods, into goods, and sent back to their families. Well, I worked it out, about 16% of it went back to their families. So basically it didn't. And that fund built up it was a large fund. It built up so that the government used it to finance the segregated hospitals, they used it to finance the missions, and the rudest thing of all they did was use it to finance the deportation of the islanders in the 1900s. And to do that, they passed the money to the Commonwealth. It was Commonwealth business, not Queensland business. But that's where a lot of the money came from. And Queensland exhausted the fund and then closed it down. So I tried then to work out, well, if this money, what was it worth? And I tried to work it out in present day values. That's very hard to do because of inflation and things like that. Roughly, I think they knocked off about 30 million modern Australian dollars. Now, it was legal, but it was legal because in the Act, I checked the Act, and what it said in the Act was that at the discretion of the minister. It always does. If you look in the Act, there'll be a little clause that says the minister can override anything. That clause is in that Act. So he didn't act illegally, just immorally.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Did anyone else have a question, or are we all happy to move on to the film? Yeah? Thank you, Professor.
I've just got one. Sorry,
We're sort of running against time.
just a quick question. I just want to say thanks everyone for organising. It's been a fantastic night and so informative. And The question was, I just waited for 5. Sorry, I was just wondering about, and I've spoken to Zach a little bit about this, but like with the sugar industry today, is there any, like when you buy Bundaberg sugar and that kind of thing, there doesn't seem to be any recognition that the industry was built through the blackbirding industry, and I was just wondering if you guys are doing any work or, around that and, trying to advocate to the sugar industry or anything.
We hosted our first conference, which saw some 500 plus South Sea mob come to in Bundaberg in 2012. We approached the cane cutters. I've got a massive database. We approached Bundaberg Sugar. They gave us caps and lolly bags. Yeah, and they can't, they just denied and didn't want to engage in any conversation. So, another platform that we need support on is breaking down that sort of ignorance or not wanting to be involved. But thank you to Mus, Professor Clive Moore, and he's going to get on the phone. We might start with the film. I know that Lola was saying people might want a toilet break, but we will start the film. So if you want to move quickly, that'd be great. The toilets are out to the right. But we might just go with it now. But thank you to everybody that participated. Really appreciate it.
We want to announce the toilet side. She did.
To the right.
If anybody wants to run for the toilet, go. Just
Yeah.
Thank you, sir.
No, that's it.
Turn it off now.
Thank you. Go.
Thank you, everybody.
So we've got it right there.